A single Tomahawk cruise missile costs $2.2 million. For the same amount of money, 775 children could be covered on Medicaid for a full year, or 3,600 children could be fed through the National School Lunch Program. The United States fired hundreds of Tomahawk missiles in the opening days of Operation Epic Fury. By the sixth day of the war, the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the cost at $11.3 billion. By day 12, the estimate reached $16.5 billion. By the end of the second week, the National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett confirmed on CBS News that the operation had cost approximately $12 billion, and the Pentagon had already assembled a $50 billion supplemental budget request to replace the Tomahawk missiles, Patriot interceptors, THAAD systems, and other equipment expended or damaged in the first week alone. $12 billion in 2 weeks on a war that was never authorized by Congress, never voted on by the American people, and launched by a president who won his election on a promise to lower the cost of groceries. While 1 in 3 Americans was skipping meals because they could not afford food, while 14% of households reported food insecurity, while 29% of Americans had delayed or skipped medical care because of cost, while 34% of Americans had skipped a meal in the past year, while SNAP benefits were being cut by $295 billion, while Medicaid was being slashed by $1 trillion, while the ACA subsidies that protected 22 million Americans were allowed to expire. They found the money for Tomahawk missiles. They could not find the money for your groceries. They chose war, and you paid for it, and you are still paying for it. And I am going to show you with specific numbers exactly how much you paid, exactly what was taken from you to pay it, and exactly who made the decision to prioritize the destruction of Iranian infrastructure over the survival of American families. Because the contrast between what the government chose to fund and what it chose to cut is the most morally obscene arithmetic in modern American fiscal history. The same government that told you SNAP benefits had to be reduced by $295 billion because the country could not afford them found unlimited emergency funding for cruise missiles within 72 hours of the first strike. The same Congress that eliminated ACA subsidies because $30 billion per year was too expensive approved a $50 billion Pentagon supplemental request to replace the missiles that were fired in the first week. The same administration that imposed work requirements on 55-year-olds who cannot find jobs in order to save money on food stamps spent $891 million per day, every day, for weeks, on an operation that the majority of the American public opposed. And the American public is absorbing both sides of the equation. They are paying for the war through their taxes. And they are paying for the war's consequences through the inflation it created at the grocery store, the gas pump, and the utility bill. You are being charged twice, and nobody asked your permission for either charge. The first 100 hours cost $3.7 billion, and that was before the war even started in earnest. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published the most detailed cost analysis available of Operation Epic Fury, and the numbers are staggering by any measure. The first 100 hours of the operation, approximately 4 days, cost $3.7 billion. That works out to $891.4 million per day, nearly $1 billion a day. The biggest driver of cost in those opening days was high-end munitions. The U.S. relied heavily on long-range precision weapons like Tomahawk cruise missiles at $3.5 million per missile and the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile at comparable costs. More than 2,000 munitions were expended in the first days of the campaign. Munitions replenishment alone was estimated at $3.1 billion, plus an ongoing rate of $758 million per day. The pre-strike military buildup, including repositioning aircraft, deploying more than a dozen naval vessels, and mobilizing regional assets, cost an estimated $630 million before a single bomb was dropped. 2 aircraft carrier strike groups were deployed, the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln, at a cost of approximately $6.5 million per day each just for normal operations. More than 200 military aircraft were deployed to the region. More than 50,000 personnel were committed. And on March 2nd, Kuwaiti forces accidentally shot down 3 American F-15 fighter jets in a friendly fire incident. Each F-15 costs approximately $117 million, representing a total loss of $351 million in a single incident that was not caused by the enemy but by a coalition partner. By the 4th day, The military had approached what officials described as a ____0 where they ran low on the most expensive long-range weapons and shifted to cheaper, shorter-range alternatives. A JDAM-guided bomb costs under $100,000 compared to $3.5 million for a Tomahawk. That transition brought daily costs down to approximately $500 million per day by the second week. But even at the reduced rate, the burn rate remained enormous, and $3.5 billion of the initial $3.7 billion was unbudgeted, prompting the Pentagon to seek emergency funding from Congress. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimated that a 2-month limited conflict without ground troops would cost between $40 billion and $95 billion in direct military costs alone. If prolonged or expanded, costs could surpass $100 billion. And the former UK military official interviewed by Al Jazeera noted that while the US has ramped up missile production, the numbers are low compared to what is needed, and that NATO countries have their own orders competing for the same production lines. House Minority Leaders said they cannot find a dime for your doctor, but they found billions for bombs. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries stood at the Capitol Hill podium and said on the record that President Trump is, quote, 1 and, quote, 2. And then he said the sentence that should be printed on a billboard outside every grocery store in America. He said, quote, 3. That is the House Minority Leader describing the choice that was made, and the Center for American Progress quantified the choice in terms that are impossible to argue with. At more than $5 billion and counting in just the first few days of operations, the costs of Operation Epic Fury could cover SNAP benefits for more than 2 million Americans for a full year. The $59.39 million per day that the Institute for Policy Studies estimated in daily operational costs for deployed military systems alone could instead cover the daily costs of Medicaid for more than 4 million Americans, or SNAP for more than 9.5 million Americans. Time magazine broke it down further using the $12 billion 2-week figure. That amount could cover a full year of food assistance for 5.5 million Americans, roughly 13% of all SNAP recipients, or a little over 1 month of SNAP benefits for every single American currently enrolled in the program. It could finance a full year of Medicaid for 1.3 million people, a population roughly the size of Dallas, Texas. It could provide housing assistance for 800,000 to 1.5 million low-income Americans for a year. It could cover a year of child care for roughly 900,000 children at the average cost of $13,000 per child. It could provide 1.6 million students with a full Pell Grant for a year. And the Congressional Budget Office Director confirmed in Senate testimony on March 11th that extending the enhanced ACA tax credits that help 22 million Americans afford health insurance would have cost approximately $30 billion for 1 year. At the burn rate of the Iran war, the United States would spend the equivalent of those annual subsidies in approximately 5 weeks of fighting. 5 weeks of war equals 1 year of health insurance for 22 million Americans. And Congress chose the war and let the subsidies expire. And 5 million Americans are expected to lose health insurance coverage as a result, according to the Commonwealth Fund. The war costs more in a month than the subsidies that protect 22 million Americans cost in a year. And the subsidies were deemed too expensive. And the war was deemed necessary. Those two sentences describe the moral architecture of the American federal budget in 2026. And I want to stay on this comparison because it reveals the lie at the center of every budget debate you have witnessed for the past decade. Every time a social program is proposed or defended, the first question from the opposition is ___4. How do you pay for universal pre-K? How do you pay for extended ACA subsidies? How do you pay for expanded SNAP? How do you pay for Medicare dental coverage? How do you pay for affordable housing? The question is treated as an inviolable principle of fiscal responsibility. The money must come from somewhere. The offset must be identified. The CBO score must balance. And then a war starts, and $16.5 billion materializes in 12 days. And $50 billion in supplemental funding is requested without a CBO score. And nobody asks __, quote, _5, because war spending is treated as inherently necessary in a way that feeding children, housing families, and covering medical care is not. The fiscal responsibility that was invoked to justify cutting $100 per month from the SNAP benefits of 600,000 low-income households evaporated the moment the first Tomahawk left its launch tube. The money was always there. The question was never whether the country could afford it. The question was what the country chose to afford. And the country, through the decisions of its president and the acquiescence of its Congress, chose to afford a war and chose not to afford groceries. The word quote _6 is doing the work of concealment here. The United States is the wealthiest country in the history of human civilization. It does not lack the resources to feed its population, ensure its sick, house its working families, and educate its children. It lacks the political will to prioritize those expenditures over military expenditures that benefit defense contractors, geopolitical positioning, and the domestic political narratives of the officials who authorize them. The $12 billion spent in 2 weeks was not taken from a vault. It was borrowed, added to the national debt, which is projected to grow by $3 trillion because of the OBBBA alone. And the interest on that debt will be paid by the same taxpayers whose grocery bills went up because of the war the debt is funding. The war made your groceries more expensive, and the money they spent on bombs could have made them cheaper. The economic damage of the war to ordinary American households operates through 2 channels simultaneously. The direct channel is the taxpayer cost of the military operations. The indirect channel is the inflation that the war created by disrupting global energy supplies. Both channels extract money from the American household. The direct channel extracts it through federal taxation and deficit spending. The indirect channel extracts it through higher prices at the gas pump and the grocery store. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz disrupted 20% of global oil supplies. Oil prices surged from $70 per barrel before the war to $120 at their peak. Gasoline in the United States jumped from less than $3 per gallon to above $4.15. The March CPI showed energy prices increasing 10.9% in a single month, gasoline up 21.2%, and fuel oil up more than 30%. The annual inflation rate climbed from 2.4% to 3.3%. And those price increases hit hardest at the grocery store, where energy costs are embedded in every step of the supply chain, from fertilizer to diesel to refrigeration to delivery. At the same time, the war was making groceries more expensive through the energy channel. The same government that launched the war was cutting the programs that help Americans afford groceries. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act slashed $295 billion from SNAP funding over the next decade, a 36% reduction. Benefits were cut by approximately $100 per month for 600,000 low-income households. Work requirements were expanded to include adults ages 55 to 64. And 8 million seniors who depend on SNAP to eat are facing both the benefit cuts and the price increases simultaneously. The $12 billion spent in the first 2 weeks of the war could have offset the SNAP benefit cuts for millions of Americans for a full year. Instead, the $12 billion was spent on cruise missiles that destroyed Iranian infrastructure while American grocery prices climbed and American food assistance was cut. The missiles were launched. The groceries got more expensive. The food stamps were reduced. And the same Americans who are paying higher taxes to fund the war are paying higher prices because of the war and receiving less government assistance to manage those higher prices. They are being hit from 3 directions by a single decision. The decision to go to war, a decision they never voted for, and the cruelty of the timing is not lost on the families who are living through it. The war began on February 28th. Grocery prices were already up 36% from 2014. Egg prices were already at historic highs from the avian influenza that killed more than 185 million birds. Coffee prices were already up 19% year over year. Beef was already up 15%. 1 in 3 Americans had already skipped a meal in the past year. Food, banks were already reporting record demand. And then the Strait of Hormuz closed and diesel went up 30% in a month, and the trucking companies that deliver every item on every grocery shelf in America adjusted their fuel surcharges, and the fertilizer companies that supply every farm in America adjusted their input costs, and the utility companies that power every processing plant and every cold storage facility in America adjusted their rates, and every single one of those adjustments landed within 60 to 120 days on the price tag that you read at the grocery store. And the government that caused the price increase by launching the war simultaneously cut the program that helps Americans absorb price increases. The SNAP cuts are not separate from the war. They are part of the same budget, the same fiscal architecture that found $50 billion for a supplemental defense request could not find $30 billion for ACA subsidies. The money flowed to the Pentagon and away from the grocery budget of the American family in a single, continuous fiscal decision made by the same people in the same building during the same legislative session. Hundreds of rural hospitals are closing while the Pentagon requests $50 billion to replace the missiles it already shot. Common Dreams reported that hundreds of hospitals across the United States, most of them in rural areas, are teetering on the brink of bankruptcy or closure in the wake of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act's healthcare cuts. Rural hospitals depend disproportionately on Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements because their patient populations are older, lower income, and more dependent on government insurance programs than urban populations. When Medicaid is cut by $1 trillion over a decade, the hospitals that serve the communities most dependent on Medicaid are the first to fail, and they are failing now. At the same time, the Pentagon assembled a $50 billion supplemental budget request to replace the Tomahawk missiles, Patriot interceptors, and other munitions expended in the first week of the war. Al Jazeera reported that the Pentagon's request was, quote, 7 and that, quote, 8. The journalist Zaid Jilani summarized the contrast in one sentence that I cannot improve upon. He said, quote, 9 Graham Plattner, a Democrat running for Senate in Maine, asked, quote, 10A Reuters/Ipsos poll conducted hours after the strikes began showed dismal approval for the war from the American public. The majority of Americans did not want this war. They were not asked. And now they are paying for it while the hospitals that serve them are closing and the insurance that covers them is being cut to fund tax reductions for people who will never stand in a grocery checkout line wondering if they can afford both the milk and the eggs. The cost of a single Patriot missile interceptor is approximately $4 million. During the war, the U.S. and its allies fired hundreds of interceptors against Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. CSIS noted that those defensive systems are not only costly to use, but extremely difficult to replenish quickly because the manufacturing process for a Patriot missile takes months and the production lines are already committed to orders from NATO countries and other allies. The missiles used to defend against Iranian retaliation are more expensive per unit than the missiles used for offense. And every interceptor fired is an interceptor that is not available for the next threat, whether that threat comes from Iran, from China, from North Korea, or from a future adversary that the defense establishment has been warning about for years. The war is not just consuming dollars, it is consuming the physical stockpile of weapons that the United States needs for its own defense. And the cost of replenishing that stockpile will be paid by the same taxpayers who are skipping meals, delaying prescriptions, and choosing between their electric bill and their grocery bill every month. And there is a detail in the munitions story that crystallizes the absurdity of the spending priorities more clearly than any dollar figure. CSIS reported that by the fourth day of the war, the United States had exhausted most of its high-end long-range munitions and transitioned to cheaper bombs. The military literally ran out of Tomahawks. The $3.5 million missiles that were fired by the hundreds in the first 100 hours were not available in sufficient quantities to sustain the campaign past the first week, and the production lines that make those missiles are already committed to orders from NATO allies and other countries. Patriot interceptors, which cost approximately $4 million each, are produced at a rate that cannot keep pace with wartime consumption. The U.S. had approximately 2,000 Patriot missiles in inventory before the war. Hundreds were fired in the first week defending against Iranian retaliation. CSIS estimated that FY 2026 scheduled deliveries of 172 Patriot missiles would only partially replenish what was expended. At the current rate of consumption, the United States is depleting its defensive missile stockpile faster than it can manufacture replacements, which means the $50 billion supplemental request is not just about paying for what was already used. It is about funding the accelerated production of weapons that the industrial base cannot currently produce at the required rate. The defense industrial base, like the healthcare system, like the food assistance program, like the housing market, has been operating at the margins for years. And the war exposed those margins the same way it exposed the margins in every other system it touched. The difference is that when the military runs out of missiles, Congress funds an emergency supplemental. When Americans run out of food, Congress cuts their benefits. The war was never authorized by Congress, and the people paying for it never consented to pay. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 allows the President to deploy military forces for 60 days without congressional authorization, after which the President must obtain authorization or withdraw the forces. Operation Epic Fury began on February 28, 2026. The 60-day clock expired in late April. Congress has not voted to authorize the military operations. No resolution has been introduced, no debate has been held, no vote has been taken, and the American taxpayer, whose money is funding the $500 million per day current burn rate, whose grocery prices have risen because of the war, whose gasoline costs have jumped because of the war, whose inflation rate has spiked because of the war, whose retirement accounts have fluctuated because of the war, has not consented through their elected representatives to any of it. The President made the decision, the Pentagon executed it, the taxpayer funded it, Congress watched. And the American public discovered the cost from CSYS reports and Al Jazeera investigations and Time magazine analyses because the Pentagon has not released an official cost estimate. The Department of Defense has not publicly confirmed the total cost of the operation. The figures that exist in the public domain come from think tank estimates, classified briefings leaked to reporters, and statements from administration officials on Sunday morning talk shows. The people paying for the war are the last to know what it costs, and the irony is suffocating. The same Congress that found $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts, that found $295 billion in SNAP cuts, that found $4.7 trillion in tax reductions, that found these numbers after months of debate and scoring and negotiation and political horse trading, has not found the time to hold a single vote on whether to authorize a military operation that is costing $500 million per day. They debated for months over whether Americans over 55 should have to document 80 hours of work per month to keep their Medicaid coverage. They did not debate for a single day over whether to spend $16.5 billion in 12 days on a war in the Middle East. The priorities are in the numbers, and the numbers are in your grocery receipt, your gas pump display, your insurance premium, and your tax return. They chose war, and you paid for it. You are paying for it right now, today, at the gas station, at the pharmacy, at the grocery store checkout. Every price increase that the war generated is a tax on the American household that was never voted on, never debated, and never consented to. It is the most expensive decision made by the federal government this year, and it was made by one person, without asking the country that is paying the bill. And the Democratic failure embedded in that sentence is not a technicality. It is the foundational violation from which every other harm flows. If Congress had been required to debate and vote on the war before it began, the cost projections would have been public. The $891 million per day estimate would have been presented in hearings. The comparison to SNAP and Medicaid would have been made on the Senate floor. The CBO would have been asked to score the military operation the way it scores every domestic spending bill. And every member of Congress would have had to go on the record in front of their constituents and say either, quote, 11 or, quote, 12. They would have had to own the choice. Instead, the choice was made for them. The President launched the strikes. The Pentagon executed the operation. The supplemental request was sent to Congress after the money was already spent, and the members of Congress who will face their voters in November 2026 will claim they had no say in it. But they had a say in the Medicaid cuts. They had a say in the SNAP reductions. They had a say in letting the ACA subsidies expire. They had a say in every domestic spending decision that took money away from American families. They chose to exercise their constitutional power to cut food assistance and health care, and they chose not to exercise their constitutional power to authorize or block a war. The war was free from accountability. The groceries were not. And that asymmetry, the asymmetry between the scrutiny applied to feeding Americans and the scrutiny applied to bombing Iran, is the clearest possible illustration of what this government values and what it does not. And here is the number that nobody in Washington will put on a chart because the chart would end careers. The total economic cost to the American economy from the Iran war, including direct military spending, indirect inflation effects, stock market losses, increased consumer borrowing costs, reduced economic growth, and decreased consumer spending, is estimated by analysts to range between $50 billion and $210 billion. That range, calculated before the ceasefire collapsed, before the Islamabad talks failed and before the naval blockade was declared, represents the cost of a single foreign policy decision to the economic output of the United States. At the low end, $50 billion is more than the entire annual budget of the Department of Homeland Security. At the high end, $210 billion exceeds the combined annual budgets of the Departments of Education, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, and Energy, and the cost falls disproportionately on the Americans who can least afford it. The 40 million Americans on SNAP who are absorbing both the benefit cuts and the food price increases driven by the energy shock. The 21 million Medicaid expansion enrollees who are about to face work requirements while the $50 billion Pentagon supplemental request sails through committee. The 5 million Americans who lost health insurance because the $30 billion annual cost of ACA subsidies was deemed unaffordable in the same budget that found unlimited funding for an unauthorized war. And the 159 million American workers whose real wages have been eroded by war-driven inflation that pushed the CPI from 2.4% to 3.3% in the span of weeks. The war is not a line item in someone else's budget. The war is inside your budget. It is in the $4.15 you paid at the pump this morning. It is in the $1.29 extra your dozen eggs cost this month. It is in the 0.9% monthly CPI increase that is eating your paycheck before you get to spend it. It is in the 3.3% annual inflation rate that is compounding on top of the 26% cumulative price increase that already happened before the first Tomahawk was launched. Every dollar of that damage was caused by a choice. A choice made by people who will never stand in a checkout line and wonder if they can afford both the bread and the medicine. A choice that was never put to a vote. A choice whose cost was hidden from the people who are paying it. Until now. And the numbers you just heard are not estimates from partisan think tanks trying to score political points. They are from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most respected defense policy institutions in the world. From the Center for American Progress, from the Institute for Policy Studies, from Time Magazine, from the Congressional Budget Office, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the Pentagon's own classified briefings leaked to reporters because the Department of Defense refused to publish them publicly. The evidence is not in dispute, only the silence around it is.